We are really delighted to have with us for our long-standing ambassador series at the Center for Politics at the University, run by the able Damon Irby over here. We're honored to have His Excellency Joe Hockey, Ambassador of Australia to the United States. He is a very busy guy, and he went golfing very recently with President Trump, and of course I asked him two questions. Did Trump cheat? And because that's what I would have suspected, but he said no. And I said, well, surely then you went to one of his golf courses. Of course! So you have to funnel that money into the Trump family. They don't have enough. He is flying to New York right after this, so we have him for a limited period, and we do have to get him out at around 6:20, just so you know. But he's going to talk and then take some questions, and I've been chatting with him about Australian politics and American politics, and he's got a lot of very interesting things to say. Let me give him a all too quick introduction. Damon took this from the Department of State description of the U.S. relationship with Australia, and it's all in superlatives, and I think we can skip it. I appreciate your letting me read it, but I am concerned because all of a sudden our special relationship is with France. I always thought the United States special relationship was with the UK, and we're two-timing the UK. I don't think Theresa May even knows. That's so often true in those sorts of arrangements. But truly, I think Australia can make the case equally well, actually better than France, that we have a special relationship. I think you call it the mateship. That's how you distinguish it. I like that. So I want you to tell us a bit about that if you can. Let me just tell you a little bit about Ambassador Hockey for those who might not know. He was posted here in January 2016 following a long and distinguished career in public service. He entered the Australian Parliament in 1996, where he remained for 17 years. He was a minister in a variety of portfolios, including financial services, small business and tourism, human services, and employment and workplace relations. In 2013, Ambassador Hockey was appointed treasurer of the Commonwealth, and he was responsible for all economic policy, including fiscal policy. He served as chair of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors in 2014 and a member of the leadership in 2015. As treasurer, he was a regular delegate to the IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and APEC meetings. In other words, he is a member of the deep state. I think we should go ahead and identify him, just get it out of the way for those of you who believe in conspiracies. Mr. Ambassador, many of the students in this room are currently studying Australia in a special seminar hosted by Professor Mark Thomas. Where are they? Raise your, yes, there you go. Nice to see you, and they're all over there. We're thrilled to have you here. Thanks for coming. And we will bill you for the food. The food's just free for my students. Sorry, times are tough sometimes. We're also joined by guests from Sweetbriar College. We're the Sweetbriar College students. Well, we have two of you anyway. That's great. And they will perform later this summer in an international dance event called Adelaide. That sounds, would you do a little bit for us here? Or? Oh, okay. Well, if the ambassador has to leave early, you know what you're going to be doing. And finally, Professor Margot Smith was just talking to the ambassador, the director and curator of the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection. And she was describing a bit of it. Where did you go? There you are. It sounds fascinating, and you should go over there and take a look. And thank you all for joining us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Virginia welcome to His Excellency Joe Hockey, Ambassador of Australia to the United States.
Thank you so much, Doctor. To all of you, thank you so much for coming along late in the afternoon. Usually, the drinking age here is much higher than it is in Australia. So by this hour, when I was on campus, it was a very different environment. But it is a great pleasure to be here, and what a magnificent set of grounds. I'm not allowed to call them campus, but apparently Jefferson's very much alive. So thank you very much for coming. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the Australian relationship with the United States and then talk a little bit about politics, because that was my vocation for 2 decades before I came here. I'm not a career diplomat. This is my first post, and I assume it'll be my last post. So, especially when I give speeches like this. So, I want to take you back to the beginning of the 20th century. Australia and Argentina had the highest per capita wealth in the world. Australia was an incredibly rich nation, but it had only 4 million people. And it is a land the size of the continental United States. And we didn't have a war in order to set our foundations. The doctor mentioned a little bit earlier that there's a special relationship now with France. Well, I can report to you that we're the only ally that hasn't had a war with the United States. You've gone to war with the Brits, the Canadians, the Mexicans, in fact, most people, but not us. So that's why we have a special relationship. That's right, it's a long way away. But in fact, it was Americans that fired the first shots in the only attempted rebellion in Australia against the British. See the bad influence you were. And it was the Eureka Stockade. And the first soldiers that were called to arms were the California Riflemen for the rebel group. Most Australians are unaware of that. But what we are aware of is that in the early 1900s, the Great White Fleet, Teddy Roosevelt's Navy, was sailing to Asia. Importantly, for historical reasons, we remind people it sailed through the South China Sea. But it was invited to come to Australia by our Prime Minister, Alfred Deakin. Australia had only been around as a federation for 9 years, and we were very much under the yoke of the British Empire. We're part of the British Empire. And our Prime Minister said, we're going to have to find our own feet, our own independence. So he wrote to Teddy Roosevelt and said, can you please send the fleet here? And they came into the grand Sydney Harbour, and the Prime Minister brought his cabinet down to the harbour, and he pointed to the ships and he said, we need to have a navy. And thankfully they commissioned our first ships, which came into operation at the beginning of 1914 when we were first called to war. To show you how tight the umbilical cord was between the British and the Australians at that time, when we were called to war in 1914, we had a population of 5 million people. We sent an army overseas, it was all men at that time, of 363,000, about 8% of our population. 65% of them were killed or injured. 65% were killed or injured, fighting for Mother England on the other side of the world. And it was a brutal way for us to learn to become an independent nation. Our friends, our mates, our brothers and sisters in New Zealand, they only had a population of 1 million. They mobilised an army of 10% of their population, and they had a casualty rate of 58%. So we were cannon fodder. And in 1918, and this was a telling moment, when your President Woodrow Wilson agreed with your Congress to enter into the war, he laid down a 14-point plan. And amongst the points he said were Articles 2 and 3. Article 2 talked about freedom of navigation of the seas. He said, this is the way we're going to define the United States' engagement with the world. We want freedom of the oceans. And we still use that in discussions with the White House and the Pentagon today to refer to the South China Sea. That's why there is anxiety about it. It's a long-standing American principle. The other one, Article 3, was freedom of trade. And we use that as well in very blunt terms with the administration. And that's what made America great in the first place. Its engagement in the world based on a core set of principles. Principles of freedom, of enterprise, of innovation, of family, community, the freedom to determine your own destiny. That was the American dream, and still is the American dream. And in 1918, after the Germans had managed to come to an agreement with Russia, they were able to move 1 million soldiers from the Russian front to fight on the Western Front in France. our soldiers were decimated. And our lead general was asked by the commander of the 4th British Army to launch an attack on a town called Hamel in western France. And he said, my team is decimated. My soldiers are decimated. They're buried in your soil. How are we going to do this? And he was told that the Americans had come along. They hadn't fought since the Civil War. There was 1 million of them coming, but they were pretty untrained and certainly hadn't been fighting for 4 years. And Monash said, well, let's see how we go. We'll train with the Americans, give us 10 companies, and we'll train together. We'll see how it goes. And the Americans and the Australians started training together, and they became mates and buddies. They realised how much they liked each other, how similar they were. You know, it upsets the British when I say it, but the diaries actually state that one of the things that united the Americans and Australians was they didn't like the British. But the British, themselves were absolutely decimated. It was a horrific, horrific war. And after 3 weeks of training, Monash, our general, reported back that he was ready to attack Hamel. General Pershing heard about it and said, stop. And he pulled the Americans out. He said, we're not going to fight under a foreign general. And the Americans peeled off their uniforms and started putting on Australian uniforms. And they said, we're not going to walk away from our buddies. So Pershing gave in. He said, you can have 3 companies, but they've got to be embedded with the Australians. And out of respect for the Americans, Monash delayed the attack until the 4th of July. He took the town of Hamel in 93 minutes, turning the First World War. About 7 Americans received British honours, and the Australians insisted that an American flag be raised above the town of Hamel. We are the only country on earth that has fought side by side with you in every single major conflict for 100 years. The 4th of July this year is the 100th anniversary. And that's why we call it mateship. Because a mate, in Australian terms, is someone that is there during the good times and the bad times. And when it gets really rough, we double up. You never walk away. You can have your disagreements. You can be very honest with each other, as we are. But you never, ever undermine each other, and certainly not publicly. You work together to meet head-on the joint challenges that we face. That's mateship. And today, we have an extremely deep relationship with the United States that many people aren't aware of. The most powerful intelligence partnership in the world is known as Five Eyes. It's the Anglosphere. It's the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States. We share almost all our intelligence with each other. We don't spy on each other, which is good. We have an enormous and deep relationship. So of the 16 intelligence agencies here in the United States, we have people in all of them. And some of your most valuable intelligence comes from some of our sources. At a military level, we are spending $15 million a day buying American equipment. After Saudi Arabia, we're the second biggest purchaser of equipment. But more significantly, we have military personnel in 32 US states. And the role in partnership that we're playing, particularly in the Asian region, is phenomenal. In Iraq, we've had, until this year, we had the second biggest foreign military force operating in Iraq. Second biggest. And we're a long way away from Iraq. But we do it because we share values. We know that the threat of terrorism is a threat in our hometown. We've had 14 sophisticated attempted terrorist attacks in Australia. And overwhelmingly, a large number of them failed because of the partnership of Five Eyes, because of the work that your intelligence people helped us to do. And of course, at a trade level, you are our biggest investor, but you are our second biggest trading partner. By far, our biggest trading partner is China. And we sit right in the middle of the relationship between the United States and China. We are, obviously very involved in Korea as well because we were there fighting. We lost a large number of soldiers in Korea. So we have a deep and abiding interest in everything to do with the United States and its security. And we do it on a daily basis. So you'd say to yourself, well, there's a famous phone call that occurred between the President and the Prime Minister about immigration. You say, well, everything apparently is leaked here in the United States and the transcript of that phone call got out. Can I say to you that the relationship is far, far bigger than any two individuals, no matter what position they occupy? And it goes back to the Aussies and the Americans training together before the Battle of Hamel. We actually like each other as nations. We love Americans coming to Australia. Australians love coming to America. About 1 million people travel each year, both ways. And it's a long way away, we recognise that. But 16 hours on a plane, depending where you go from. But we describe it as a movie, a meal and a good sleep. For those of you heading down, just remember that. The relationship between the President and the Prime Minister is actually very strong. And that's because we're not going to be judgmental. We're not going to be judgmental. Everyone's passing judgment on the United States and its president at the moment. None more so than the American people, all the time. But you can't allow anti-Trump sentiment to become anti-American sentiment. The world can't afford for that to happen. That's why President Macron was over here. That's why Chancellor Merkel is coming on Friday. That's why the President just announced he's going to the UK in July. That's why our Prime Minister has been over twice. That's why Shinzo Abe goes to Mar-a-Lago. That's why, the end of the day, Xi Jinping went to Mar-a-Lago. That's why we have to keep talking. We have to keep engaging. And America first doesn't mean America alone. But America first also, it's not the natural instinct of America to put itself first. But it is the instinct of America to focus on itself. I mean, you have a country that is the only global empire in the history of humanity that hasn't wanted to lead. You haven't invaded other countries in order to spread the American word, to create American exceptionalism. You haven't done what the Greeks did and the Egyptians did and the Persians did and the Romans did and the British did and the Portuguese did and the Spanish did. You haven't gone and used imperial might to take over the world. You've been dragged kicking and screaming into the First World War, dragged kicking and screaming into the Second World War when your partners were on their knees, because there is a deep reluctance after the scars of the Civil War. There's a deep reluctance to be, an imperial power. And so we had this golden history in the United States when America truly did become great. And it became great because it was a bit reluctant, but when called to lead, it did. It led in trade. It led in advocacy for democracy. It led in the advocacy for freedom. They're the strengths of the United States. And as soon as it abandons its strengths, it'll become much weaker. And we see it. I live in I live in Washington, but I'm an Australian. My country is in the fastest growing region, not only in the world, but in the history of humanity, by far. I mean, we've never seen anything like the growth of Asia. It was the middle class of Europe that drove European exceptionalism in the 19th century and arguably the beginning of the 20th century. It was that middle class that emerged that helped to drive European commerce. And it was the American middle class that drove the greatness of the United States in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, it's going to be Asia. It's going to be Asia unquestionably. And you have 320 million people in your middle class. Asia has today 1 billion, and it's going to go to 2 billion within probably 6 years. And they are consumers. And the biggest economic growth in your economy comes from household consumption. That is the biggest driver of growth in your economy. It's the biggest driver of growth in ours. Biggest driver of growth in China has been manufacturing, construction, industrial activity. But with the emergence of this massive consumer class, it is a world changer. And then you've got India coming with 1.5 billion people, Indonesia coming with over 200 million, Vietnam coming, a whole range of others. So by the middle of this century, my children are going to be in a world where 4 of the 6 biggest economies are in the Asia-Pacific region. A complete turnaround from what my father had. And that is a dynamic change that the United States needs to be aware of. Isolationism will be a graveyard for the United States. But actually, you've got values that everyone wants to sign up to. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, from our perspective, is not so much about trade. It's about who sets the rules for the Indo-Pacific region. Who sets the rules about protection of intellectual property? Who sets the rules about the rule of law? Who sets the rules about quality of trade? Who sets the rules? And we wanted to be part of the American Pacific Alliance that was going to help to set the rules for Asia. And in fact, Vietnam had the most at risk. And you napalmed Vietnam 50 years ago. And they want to side with you ahead of any other country, including their next door neighbour, China. Because they want to sign up to American exceptionalism that made America great in the first place. So that was a major, major error, a mistake, pulling out of TPP. And yet, the majority of Americans are ambiguous about it. So sometimes you just need to be reminded that you are great. You were great, you are great, and you'll continue to be great, so long as you adhere to your principles. And sometimes you need a great mate like us to remind you that your principles are powerful and enduring. And for God's sake, there's been hundreds of thousands. In fact, 600,000 Americans and over 120,000 Australians that have died for those principles. That's why they matter. Finally, I'll just say this. You can ask me questions about politics and where it's all heading. But don't think, as someone who's spent 25 years in politics, don't think there's anything exceptional about what's happening at the moment. It looks exceptional, it feels exceptional, but what is happening in the United States is happening all around the world. A massive loss of faith in institutions, a massive loss of faith in government, a deep stream of anger in the community from people feeling as though they've not been heard. You should be celebrating the fact, whether it's right or wrong, no matter what the outcome, you should celebrate the fact that you've got a safety valve in your democracy that lets it out. Other countries haven't got that, and increasingly they're losing it. Like Russia, like Turkey, like, obviously China. Instead of trending towards democracy, instead of trending towards giving people a voice, it's being taken away. So your democracy, it's like the sausage machine, it's not pretty, but ours is the same. But you need that safety valve for many, many reasons. So over to you for questions.
Do you want to call on people? Or?
No, you guys go. Okay. That's called a microphone. That's it. Or just talk into it.
Almighty, this is intimidating.
No.
I just spent a month in Australia, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And when I was there, I learned something about the changes that Australia was able to make in gun control. This is a very hot topic in this country.
Yeah,
and
I know.
I'm certainly interested in what you had to say, but I think it would be interesting for the group at large to hear how a country that is as large as the United States in a continental way was able so quickly to change the laws. I think it's a fascinating story, and I wished it could happen here.
Well, I was part of the Congress, Parliament, that did change the laws. And contrary to some popular opinion, it was really, really politically hard. It was painful. And it was off the back of the worst ever massacre in Australian history. And the outrage was so deep in Australia, and the anger was so deep, and we had, it was on the back of what seemed to be an annual event of a mass shooting involving innocent people. And Australians just said enough. And it took a right-wing government, I was part of a right-wing government, it took a right-wing government to do it. Left-wing governments can't do it for various political reasons. Right-wing government is the only one who can do it because it's to its base. And we had to go out and argue with our base and point out that we introduced mental health checks. We said you can't have you can't have a gun at home if you're in a city. You need to have it in a gun locker at a shooting range. You can't have ammunition together with it. You've got to have, certainly there's a cooling off period between the purchase of the gun and no semi-automatic or automatic weapons. None. There's no justification for it. And it's not as if we haven't got animals. I mean, we've got 9 of the 10 deadliest animals in the world in Australia. And according to the Marines, when we have the Marines there, we've got 10 of the 10 deadliest animals. But it was a very, very difficult debate. I don't opine on the United States because it's a different circumstance. I mean, it's very different. I mean, the prevalence of guns goes right back to, the fact that people bought guns in order to survive during the revolution and then the horrific civil war. I mean, that's a history that just can't be wiped. We didn't have that. We started as a penal colony, with the Brits coming, and everyone was a convict, including at the end of the day some of the police. So it was a different environment, but it doesn't mean you can't have standard controls like mental health checks and the fact that you've got to have a cooling off period before you buy a gun. I mean, I don't want to opine on your laws. Yes, sir. Just here.
As far as I know, there is no US ambassador to Australia, which seems a bit discourteous. But how do you think that's going to affect the mateship between the US and Australia?
Well, the relationship is very strong. I have incredible access here in the United States, and the Prime Minister rings the President when he's got something to say. The Foreign Minister right about now is speaking to Mike Pompeo, who's calling from a plane. He just got sworn in, and Mike Pompeo is ringing her about that and a number of other issues. But we'd rather have the right ambassador. And Harry Harris is someone I know very well, we all know very well. He is a 4-star admiral that is the head of the Pacific Command. He was going to come to Australia, he was about to have his hearings, but they took him and said, look, we really need you in Korea. And frankly, we need everyone in Korea that we can muster. And, for all of our lost souls in Korea, we'd support whoever the best candidate is for Korea. And over time, whatever is appropriate, we'll get the best person for Australia. See, I am a bit of a diplomat too. It's like, but I'm honest. Yeah.
On energy and electricity for your cities, I believe that a few months ago, some of your cities came up short. This in a nation that ships tons, millions of tons of oil, gas, and coal to China, and somehow they've come up short for their own people. How does it look from close up?
Well, this is part of the entire debate about renewable energy versus coal versus gas, and the debate's much more complicated in Australia. You're right. Australia is probably about now the biggest exporter of liquid gas in the world. We are the biggest exporter of coal in the world. We have the biggest reserves of uranium in the world, and we live in a region where, there are still hundreds of millions of people in India that have no electricity. Therefore, they die earlier. They can't get food. They can't refrigerate. They can't, 17,000 islands in Indonesia. for 200 million people, they still can't get refrigeration to some of those islands. So we're trying to export, but at the same time, you're right, our energy is too expensive. And so this is legacy. The state that actually had the blackouts was the one that took pride in having nearly 100% renewable energy. And that's a classic example where they just overplayed, they got it wrong. We also have massive transmission costs. A recent independent report in Australia identified that we have, gold-plated poles and wires. Not gold-plated, but you know what I mean. And that's added significant costs to electricity because we have reliable infrastructure, but we haven't got reliable supply in some places. So there have been a number of measures that have been taken, including additional renewable energy with a hydro scheme being rolled out. But our energy is still too expensive domestically. And finally, one of the things you have in the United States is people own effectively to the centre of the earth. When they own a block of land or an acre of land or a farmer out there, they own to the centre of the earth. In Australia, you only own the first 3 metres of soil. The rest belongs to the government. So mineral rights belong to the government until they're actually exploited. So farmers have been resisting having any fracking. There's plenty of gas, but they've been resisting on their beautiful agricultural land, having gurneys there pumping it. And so it's a very different environment to what you see here in the United States. Yeah. Yes, sir. What about some of the other students over here?
Yeah, you spoke briefly about the cooperation between all the Anglophone countries in the world. Where do you see that going forward with the UK leaving the European Union next year?
Well, when the UK joined the European Union, we were their best friend and then they dropped us. So they've now, keen to re-engage with other countries, including us, from a trade perspective. And we welcome that, we really do. It's a very big economy. They've got to sort out what it looks like, Brexit. I mean, they're trying to do that. It's the will of the people, so you've got to respect that. But, Europe still needs the UK and UK still needs Europe, and that's not going to change. It's a question of what that relationship really looks like. But the UK is very focused on expanding into Asia. But, one of the examples is it's all been done out of Brussels, all the trade negotiations. So when they come to negotiate, they haven't got any negotiators because they're all in Brussels. So this is one of the challenges they have as they go towards Brexit. They may well join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you'd say immediately, well, they're not in the Pacific. But it's open to anyone, including the United States, should they want to rejoin. And should they join, they get 11 free trade agreements immediately. So it's those multilateral agreements are easy access for the United Kingdom quickly. Yeah. Yep.
Given Australia's resources and the climate there, I find it surprising that the country is so gung-ho and still exporting coal and gas. I would think the population would be opposed to that because most of Australia, as I understand it, is a desert, and you have had terrible fires there that are linked to climate change. So do you have a sense that Australia is getting closer to a tipping point where maybe renewables would be the preferred energy source and you would take more of a global leadership position?
Well, of course, our coal is cleaner coal than many of the competing nations. So, in fact, the United States, by the way, is the biggest miner of coal in the world. So just getting that in there. You use it. You use all your domestic supply. I mean, for us, we've got the fastest growing region in the world. They need energy. Renewable energy is not going to power India. It's not going to bring, warmth or a light to someone in a Mumbai shantytown. Having renewable energy. They actually need energy fast, and as does China, as does all these other countries. And it's got to be a mix. It's got to be a sensible mix. I mean, our coal is much cleaner and lower emission than Chinese coal or coal from other parts of the world. And our gas, our liquid gas, is by far lower emission than many other, coal, but many other sources of energy. So, we're meeting the demand of the market, and we have to. In Australia, of course, we've spent tens of billions of dollars on incentivising renewable energy. And some of it's been really clumsy, some of it's been really good. And we're trying to be innovators in that space. For a long time, we're the innovators in solar technology. So we're constantly looking at ways to improve the technology to reduce the emissions associated with some of those energy sources. But, the world's we're not going to be a pathbreaker of, saying, hang on, we use renewable energy, but we're going to send all of our non-renewable energy to you. And that's really hypocritical. We want to try and get the best mix, and that's what we're focused on. Yes, sir.
You say that you're against, or at least the farmers are kind of, even though mineral rights are definitely owned by the state, you're saying that farmers are against fracking?
Some farmers are, yeah, it depends. Yeah, we have some fracking in parts of Australia, but it's...
Are you having any trouble with fracking?
Well, that's quite a heated debate. I'd rather not get into from downtown Charlottesville, but it's a contentious debate. But having said that, Australia, we've got a big continent with a small population, 25 million, the size of Florida. Population of Florida in an area the size of continental United States. In doing so, the challenge for us is, how do you build the roads for a big continent, 25 million people? How do you build the airports? How do you build the ports, the railway lines? How do you ensure that people in the most remote communities, Indigenous communities, get some level of support, get a school, get a hospital, it's crazy. I mean, you can drive for 300 miles in Australia and not see anyone. But there'll be, someone will walk from behind a tree, and that's where they live. Just, there's an Indigenous community that'll be, 300 miles or 200 miles from the next one. And we've failed to deliver them the same quality of life as you can deliver in the cities. But it doesn't stop us from trying. So we have to export. So there are I just want to emphasise that. With the United States, we apply no tariffs and no quotas to imports from the United States. And why? Because free trade, we run like a small business. The more people you can have walk past your shop and come in the door, the richer you're going to be. So we want the world to break down the barriers because we export far more than 4 times what we consume. And that makes us rich. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't had a recession for 26 years in Australia. We haven't had an economic downturn for 26 years. The longest continuous period of growth in the history of humanity, right? In a modern economy. And it's not an accident. You have to earn it. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask about other problems that we have and whether there's any comparable situation in Australia, and specifically with money and money in politics, money affecting businesses, lobbyists with buckets of money affecting congressmen, and whether that's a concern in Australia and whether you have any advice for America regarding that issue.
Oh. No? Yeah. Well, I find your elections obscenely expensive. I mean, it's like a special election. The first special election fought here after the new president was inaugurated. I think they nearly spent more than the entire Australian political system spent in their election. But we have government funding of political parties. So we allocate political parties a certain number, I think it's $1.50 per vote. $1.50. So there's a big role for government funding. And that reduces the take from business and sectoral interests. And, you know, unions are as powerful as big business in donating money. We have limits on the amount of money you can give, so do you, but we don't have the equivalent of super PACs. You have much better laws on foreign donations. We were, you know, all of us, either side of politics in Australia, but all sides of politics were very, didn't see it as a big issue, foreign interference, but now it's become a much bigger issue, particularly in our case with China, funding political parties, and so we are now currently introducing laws that are more akin to what you have in the United States, banning foreign donations to political parties and candidates. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for coming.
You're
First of
welcome.
all,
It only costs the university, what, $400,000 for... it's cheap. I'll take that in Australian dollars too, I don't mind.
a bit of a personal reflection question, if you can. I'm a history major here, and it seems one of the interesting things that I've found in the last 75 years in American history is domestically, local politics have kind of gone away a little bit and become much more nationalized, especially for my generation. And we've also tried to put our imprint on the world, right? Our national growth has become our international dominance in the last 75 years. You have had 20 years, you said, as a politician and then being a treasury, I don't know what you guys call it, but for us,
Secretary of
Treasury Secretary,
yeah.
right, which is usually a very internal-looking position, now has an ambassador on the international stage. Has there been any difference in your perspective as how you approach your job or the ideals that you bring to your political role, moving from, you know, having to win elections every year internally, working on your own economy, and now, you know, having speeches at the University of Virginia?
No, I enjoy this. I love this. I love the stimulation of debate. And, you know, when I finish my job, I'm going to be looking for a job, right? So, you know, if you've got any vacancies, I really appreciate it. Kind of looks pretty out there. But the politics has changed over the last 20 years. It's far more polarised. You know, it's very difficult to have a conversation in politics anymore. You talk past each other. You know, you assert. Everyone asserts something. And there's sort of a fearlessness about lying. And look, it's not one side, it's all sides. And I know what most of you are thinking, but let me, you know, we were talking a little bit earlier about the Admiral that was nominated for Veterans Affairs. And, you know, look at what happened there. I mean, he was, you know, absolutely, utterly destroyed, despite a vast number of Democrats, senior Democrats, saying, actually, he's a very good man. We never had any problem. He served 3 presidents, completely lost, as people were asserting things about, you know, character assassination. Really, you know, appalling, utterly appalling. But that's the nature of politics around the world. And, you know, the only playbook in politics these days seems to be you shore up your militant 30% of the population and then you utterly destroy your opponents. Utterly destroy your opponents. And some people do it through the democratic process, others do it through other means. And just think about countries around the world where we've seen the diminution of democracy. And you can see the various vehicles they use in order to destroy any opposition. This is a totemic change in politics. And frankly, you know, I was contemplating staying, but for various reasons, which are, you know, you can Google, I had enough. I walked out. And, you know, I thought, most people in politics leave either by defeat, death, or disgrace. I wanted to go out with dignity, and you know, it so happened afterwards, Prime Minister asked me to take on this job. I apply the same principles. I don't do a lot of the diplomatic stuff, you know, the so-called cocktail circuit, the scene in Washington. I don't really do that. I'd rather forge meaningful relationships with individuals and, when necessary, transact, but they know you're transacting. But at the end of the day, I want the United States to be successful. Even if I have a political opponent for the sake of my country and now for the sake of your country, I want you to have a good government. You know, for the sake of my kids, I want the United States to be strong. And for the sake of my children and those that follow, I want Australia to be strong. And that's why, you know, I find it a little bit easier than most others to put aside my partisanship. That's it. Thank you.
That was marvelous, Mr. Ambassador. You forged a good relationship with us, and we will make room for you. I see a number of people around here whose homes I will give you if you will stay, and we can certainly get a good job together at the University of Virginia. We get rid of administrators on a weekly basis here. You never know who's in charge around here, so you know we can do it. But seriously, we enjoyed that. You strengthened with the already very strong relationship here, anyway, between Australia and the United States, and all of us need to visit them. I mean, visit them, spend money. That's what I'm talking about. How did they get through 26 years with no recession? I want to move there. That's incredible.
We're very fussy.
Yeah, you're very fussy? Oh, so forget it, huh? Okay, I got to see that. He evaluated me very well. Thanks so much again, Mr. Ambassador. I hope you have a great trip to New York and that your travels throughout the United States are as happy and friendly as you left this crowd. Thank you.